but over next to me, so all of us should be here. Is that okay? So, yeah, sure. Thanks, Alan. Okay, so welcome to any of you who are out there and actually listening to us. That's great. And if you're not, we're just going to chat amongst ourselves and talk about our experiences so far at the Boundless Transitions exhibition at APT Gallery, which is 6 Creekside, London, SE8 4SA. And so the artists are all here, and we're going to start speaking just about the experience of being part of this exhibition, and then we will go on to discuss the future of exhibiting. So if I could pass over to you, Alan, yeah, as an exhibiting artist, and we can, I forgot to introduce myself, of course. So I'm Fionn Gunn, and this is Alan Hudson.
Hi, I'm Alan Hudson, one of the artists here. I've been a stained glass artist for a number of decades, and I have a piece here in the window where we've taken out the glass. It's a stained glass window with no glass, but coloured using aluminium. But the other aspect that I'm interested in particularly here is the interactivity using simple electronics. There are a lot of electronic devices now which are readily available, easy to use and very cheap. Sensors and cameras and so on. So people can actually interact, and that's what I'm interested in the future of exhibiting, is how we can make items which interact with the viewers.
Okay, and so over to Maureen now. Maureen, you've spent time at the exhibition, and yes, are you just about in camera? Yeah. And just a reminder to everybody here, when you're speaking, keep the microphone to your chin, and that way you know you're going to be heard, okay? So Maureen, you've spent time in the exhibition and you've been speaking to visitors. What's the thing that has struck you about the visitors to the gallery and what they're interested in?
Well, I've asked the visitors, are they artists are they artists, or do they enjoy the creative process in any way? And even if they're not artists or they don't see themselves as artists, they say, oh, actually, yes, I like working in such and such a way, which is part of their creative process. So I think it's an interesting conversation between artists and their audiences must be about the creative process and some of the themes that capture the imagination. Why are artists artists? Is because, in my view, they are completely obsessed and interested in something that takes up their curiosity, that they can't let go, and they have to pursue and reframe throughout their lives. And most people are like that, actually. If you start getting down to the depth of a human, when we start sharing, we find those interests and ideas.
And so if you could pass the mic to Ardern, who's next to you. So Ardern, your work has been quite different from Maureen's, for example. Yeah. And how have you noticed people interacting with your work at the gallery?
It's interesting. I suppose because my work is photographs, and then it activates birds that fly around the room, and it seems to really get people to move around the space a little bit more and look up, I suppose. And I don't know how much they take in of the background, the gallery around them when they're chasing birds around, but they certainly do look around much more rapidly when interacting with, I suppose, my pieces. I hope that brings them to looking at other things in the environment in a way that they hadn't maybe previously noticed. But yeah, I think that's what I've seen so far.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I've noticed people accessing your app and watching the flocks of birds. And there was one person came in today and said, oh, you know, it's so lovely to be able to look up at stuff that I walk in the streets and I've got my head on the ground, and yet there are all these wonderful migrations of birds happening. You know, so all of that is interesting. Now, what I'd also like to do is, for the purpose of the live stream, is to introduce Verity Band. They're going to be involved with the discussion proper when we start. So Verity, you've spent some time at the exhibition. have you noticed, I mean, you saw some of the visitors. Did you notice anything in particular that people were doing or responding to?
I think the main thing that struck me when people were coming in was quite how involved they were in discussions with the artists themselves. And I think that we're in sort of, we were just seeing it with Frieze Week, as you go into these mega galleries and you meet sort of the assistants salesperson. So you never actually have any direct contact with artists, which leads us to that strange thing where art feels like this sort of religious experience. You're not really allowed to question, you're not really allowed to get close to it. It's all very sort of philosophical. And the nice thing about coming into this space and being greeted by the artists themselves is I think that people have a really personal experience of the artworks, which isn't actually available to you in any galleries, especially in London.
I think that's right. And I think we've noticed with the immense enthusiasm from the visitors that we've had who've spent sometimes hours, literally hours at the exhibition, which is really great. And I'm just thinking maybe we should start the discussion proper. What do you think, Glenn? Are you ready to go with the filming? Okay, so in that case, we'll start. And just a quick reminder to everybody on the panel, please keep the mic as close to your chin as possible because it really does affect the sound of the coming across. So if you would like to start, Verity, we're talking about the future of exhibiting and coming up with our ideas and our observations and maybe a sort of mission statement about the kinds of things that we as artists or people involved in the creative sector should be going for. So if you'd like to kick off, Verity, and then perhaps bring in Joyce, okay?
Sure. Is there a question that I'm answering?
Yeah. What do you think the future of exhibiting is?
Okay. Sure. I think that that we're definitely seeing sort of the exhibiting art world being pulled in two different directions, where the things that are already very commercial and massively corporate and very sort of sterile, becoming more sterile and more corporate, more commercial, and which sort of is a nice thing because it means that more community groups and grassroots organizations and charities seem to be doing really interesting things in spaces you wouldn't expect. So I think there's bringing in at least a more varied type of venue, different types of artists. You know, it's no longer the case that in order to have an exhibition, you have to have gone to the Slade School and you know, PhD in something clever. That actually, you know, that there's probably more room than before for things. I think obviously there's like an introduction of lots of new tech, which is really exciting, but then often is sort of in the hands of really big organizations who think that it's completely acceptable to charge £40 for a family ticket to go to an event, which is just appalling, while they say that, you know, they're all about accessibility on their poster on the wall. So yeah, I hope that there's some sort of like reclamation of interesting spaces and yeah, I see it quite a lot of people saying like these are the, you know, the curators of the future, and they're, you know, doing an exhibition out of an old shoebox in Peckham, and it's like, well, yeah, but the people who are doing that are, you know, genuinely accessible for a long period of time rather than just sort of briefly interesting, I guess.
Absolutely. And if you wouldn't mind passing the mic to Joyce. Welcome, Joyce. We're delighted to have you with us. And I'd like to sort of pose the same question as I did to Verity. What do you see the future of exhibiting is? And can you see the kind of downfalls and the problems that are occurring right now and how that's going to impact exhibiting in the future?
Well, so I like to reframe things by asking questions rather than answering questions. But maybe to introduce myself, I'm an educator and a communicator, and I communicate mostly around the sociology of the built environment. And in this context, and I communicate mostly around the sociology of the built environment. And in this context, I'm interested in the relationship between the space, the art, and the public, the people. And so I think my understanding is that, for instance, galleries and exhibiting in general are kind of split, or at the moment trying to fulfill different functions. For instance, there's in our societies, even though we don't talk about it, we don't really think about it, but there is a need for a sense of rituals and monumentality and beauty that would inspire people. So this is something that we tend to think of in other cultures, in other societies, but we rarely look at European societies, for instance, and think, oh, well, yeah, there's the presence of rituals. And so very often art and the place where art is being exhibited fulfill that function, but at the same time, there's a desire to be to connect with the public, to be more accessible. And whether we like it or not, the general perception is that art and especially galleries tend to be quite elitist and cut from the people. So there's also this idea of how to connect with the people, and perhaps one of the answers would be to then open the gallery. Or maybe art does not belong in a building. Maybe art belongs outside in the street or in houses where people well, I just said not in a building, but maybe it belongs where people exist and live or work, and not out of context on a white wall. But then, so those are two opposing, I would say, opposing directions. Both of them are valid. But so yeah, I'm just posing more questions, but I have absolutely no answers.
Well, the questions themselves are very interesting and kind of profound, because the future of exhibiting also means that artists have the means to exhibit. And given that artists are some of the poorest people who are actually living in the country, have the lowest earnings, and life is a struggle for many artists, it's worth considering what that means. So, for example, if you say art outside of galleries makes it very accessible, it does. But what it also does is it usually doesn't bring in any kind of income for the artist. And how long is that sustainable for? Equally, the high-end view of the gallery is very excluding for artists as well, because nobody is there to take people who haven't gone to the right colleges or know the right people. And so you are excluded for those kinds of reasons. So what should we do about it? Has anybody got any suggestions? And don't be silent now. Okay, so Arden, for goodness sake, I know you, with your view of how technology can be used,
Yeah.
how do you see that as being something that enables people and artists to have a shared space and a shared experience?
I think it's got a huge amount of potential. I think one of the things that ends up happening, though, is, and maybe this is to Verity's point, that you get two streams of it. You get people who are producing things, they put it on things like Instagram. I mean, you and I have had a bit of a kind of thought about what we could do, maybe putting some of the kind of artworks that I do on Instagram so people can experience them from their home. One of the things that strikes me, and maybe this comes to Joyce's kind of comments on experiencing things in certain places, ritual and on monuments, is when I did most of my testing for my art pieces, and when you're working on it in something that's maybe in a format that's on a computer screen or something like that, it's got a very, very different feel to being in a space like this. So you know, you have both of those things at play, and I suppose having spaces, having galleries that are dedicated is actually kind of, it shouldn't disappear in the future. So the question is, how do you open it up more? I think APT is an excellent example. I don't know how accessible it is to lots of different artists. I think that's a question. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of potential for people creating more things and getting things out with new technologies. One of the things I would say, though, is I think some technologies are also quite exclusive, and we're beginning to see a new round of that with VR. So Apple's Apple Vision Pro is coming out next year, and that's in the region. Well, it's $3,499. It'll be, I think that'll work out to be in the region of £2,700, and that's a phenomenal price. Yeah, so technology. We're going to have some things that are tailored to that, which then might be to the exclusion of people who can't afford that. And will it be exclusive to that, or will it also kind of cover other VR technology like MetaQuest? That's still expensive, but is maybe a little bit more accessible. I mean, it's still really expensive. It's nearly £500 for the basic MetaQuest 3. So, yeah.
Well, these are, I mean, really interesting points. Does anybody want to jump in? Verity.
Oh, sorry, I have to have both of them. I was just thinking that I think the issue of that there are so few. I can't remember which newspaper released it last year, but like there are so few working class individuals making their money from full time creation, and making art has become sort of this like the privilege of people who have the money either independently or through some other means to make it. And I don't know where like whose quote this is, but it's an old quote about this idea of, my father studied war and mechanics so that I could study history and geography so that my children could study ballet and art, or something like that. And there's this idea that throughout time we've like evolved intellectually. So now that we should all be this generation of artists and creatives, but fundamentally that has not gone alongside politics that have allowed that to be followed, like to be backed up by finances. That I think the issue of how low the income is in the financial, in the creative sector, is not actually a specifically creative sector issue. It's the fact that the economy has been handled completely ineptly for over a decade. That if we had it's proven that if you have universal base income, then people do feel more free to be able to engage in creative endeavors, which are better for people's health and better for communities. I think it's Guts Gallery that, rather than, or one of the ways that they pay their artists that they represent is it's almost like I don't know, court painters, where you get a house and board and they give you a banquet every now and again. Is that they pay their artists to develop their work, whether they're selling their work, whether the work is moving, how quickly they make the work, that there is support all the way through. And for more galleries to be able to do that, you have to have galleries who are interested in a fairer model, who have the money in order to enact it. So it's an economic issue, and we sort of think of art as this icing on top, but actually it's layers and layers and layers deep underneath everyone having an absolutely terrible time.
And so, Maureen, would you like to hop in with something
Yes,
there?
I just want to put a completely different perspective on this, because we're all talking about, can you get paid for your art? And I'm thinking about, for me, the future of exhibiting goes hand in hand with the future of what the creative development is for every artist or every person involved in creative process. And I think there is a lack of education around creating your work so that you are a framework around your work. So I'm in my 60s and I'm looking back on my career, and I'm working with other artists who are also looking back on their career and about how to actually tell that story of the creative process so it's in a framework that can be handed on to the next generation. So this is bound up, I think, with the future, not only of exhibiting, but what are we exhibiting? To me, it's not just the work in a frame or the work as a monument, but the work as a process. I think of Anna Mendieta, whose work is very fragile, hardly there, and yet she was such an icon in terms of her artwork and her artistic process. So I'd like to think about the future of exhibiting as the future of creative thinking and creative approaches to life, which opens it out rather than just the framed work. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, it does open it out, but I would also say that we live in a time of freeze and the huge international art festivals, which are wildly commercial and actually reflect the increasing rift between the haves and the have-nots in society. And so, how do we counter this?
Just to bounce back, I mean, what are we saying we have and we don't have? So if we're talking about creative process, I'm thinking about the artist Kurt Schwitters, who during the war ran away from Europe and went off to the Lake District, and he found bits of rubbish to create his collages from. So I'm thinking, I think we all have the creative process. It is about, we might not have the opportunity to share that with others. So to have and have not is to me is just like, in a way, not the whole story.
It's not, but it is still a large part of it, because when we say have and have not, I'm not just talking about money. I'm actually talking about opportunity.
Okay.
And the possibility of meeting with audiences, you know, and I think at this point I should say thank you to Arts Council England for funding our project. It's been really very welcome. It's a lot of hard work to get a grant, but it was worth it, and it has enabled us to put on these kinds of panel discussions to discuss these matters. Joyce, you look like you'd like to say something.
Yeah, thank you. Well, to add to the notion of have and have not, as you said, it's not only about money. So I could rephrase that as it's not only about capital, well, financial capital, but there's also the cultural capital aspect of it, and the habitus, the ability for people to feel comfortable in those physical spaces, but also in those intellectual spaces. And that's speaking from the perspective of the public, the audience, but also, of course, of the perspective of the artist, because you might be an artist, you might be even if you have the money, but you're more likely to not have the money if you also do not have if you do not feel comfortable, if you do not feel like you belong in those kind of spaces. And so then the question is, can that be solved? I mean, my question, of course, I'm not claiming to define the questions, but my questions then would ask myself or to you is, can that be solved through exhibiting, or is it something else? Can you, as artists, can you reach out to the audience and also to potential artists? What can you do to make people feel comfortable in those spaces, or in your also intellectual space?
Hi, for 19 years, I taught students who were creating animation and game design, computer game design. And lots of those people had never been in an art gallery or museum, as some of my colleagues like Alan would recognize as well. And when we were teaching life drawing, for example, or visual language, I was trying to give and offer people the opportunity to be confident about making a mark on the page, to realize it wasn't just to do with photographic representation, but it was to do with their heart, their body, their experience, a dance, if you like, a dance with their mark making, or be it collage, be it any kind of art, and to feel comfortable about themselves, because through education previously they'd been taught they weren't good at art, or they couldn't draw, or they couldn't dance, or they couldn't do this and the other, but they could do sport, they dressed fantastic, you know, their whole, everything that they wore showed a great sense of identity and design sense. So this was all rubbish that they couldn't do anything. But it's about how we nurture people from the very beginning to have self-confidence and in their expression of their identity and the stories that they want to tell. I don't know what you think.
And sorry, could I just say, I've been a bit remiss. I didn't introduce Maureen Kendall, who is one of the Amaze artists exhibiting at this exhibition. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I would like to ask you, in what space did that education happen, this exchange, and did it happen in the same space as where you're exhibiting, or was it in a different educational space at university? What was the space?
So it was in higher education. And it's quite interesting because it would have been great for that to be alongside a studio space. And we did try to do some interventions to enable that to happen by having something what we called work-related learning. So people could come into studios and work with artists. I think that should happen more.
Yes, I worked with Maureen for many years with students who were too scared, literally too scared to walk into a gallery. They would often meet at the tube station with their friends so they could come in together. And as you talked about how these spaces have a ritual, art galleries are rather like a church where you shouldn't make a noise, you shouldn't move around quickly, you should just humbly go from picture to picture. But now I think we're in a situation where with technology, particularly like Arden's work, it doesn't need to be in a gallery. It could be in a shopping centre. It could be in a park. It could be anywhere, literally. And if people have got a phone, they can experience that art. So we can democratise, I think, the consumption of that art. But we still have the problem of how do we pay the maker? How do we pay the artist? And that still comes down to Arts Council or the local council or some funding body.
My point, I was just going to share a story that I guess is related to the conversation, which was I was sort of babysitting in a gallery while the gallerist wasn't there once a few years ago, and one of the paintings of the person of this show was facing outwards out into the street, and a school bus went by and all these school children sort of got off the bus, and maybe a lad who's maybe like 17 or something looked at this painting and said to me, because I was like in the door, like what is it, like why should I find this interesting? And I had previously sort of prided myself on being like, I talk about art in like a fun way, this will be fine. And I realized that the only reason anyone would find this piece of work remotely interesting is because they're referencing they're referencing Picasso, who's referencing Titian, who's referencing whoever. And we get to this issue where a big part of the inaccessibility of art galleries, and the reason why we feel like we have to move through art galleries like they're churches, and also it's tied in with loads of things about imagery used by fascists and all this different thing, is this concept that culture is linear and only getting better. This idea that the Romans nicked all the best stuff from the Greeks, and the Greeks nicked all the best stuff from the Egyptians, and then Europe took over, and now we're doing it completely excellently, which completely outlies anything that happened anywhere other than Europe as being quote unquote culture, even though it's hugely it's like a violent mindset to take into the world with you. So we end up with these spaces that have to uphold this sense of empire still, this sense of this is how we move and this is how we've evolved and adapted, and that is part of that that lack of access. Isn't, you don't want to go into a space where you've not been equipped with the language because you're not viewed as the inheritor of that history.
Hi. Nice to talk to you, Verity. We had good discussions earlier. And I think what you're saying is very relevant. But I just want to say that people like Picasso, Braque, those sorts of artists, and also artists before them, were influenced by other spaces besides Europe. You've got the Silk Road, which Fion's work refers to. You've got African art. You've got Japanese and Chinese printing that would influence the modernists. Lots of this so we're not in Europe, I won't even say Europe wasn't completely by itself on an island. So it is that relationship with other places in the world which I think has actually changed art and moved it in terms of the history of art.
But that relationship was based on places that we owned, so we could nip over and steal some African masks, and we could look at the Japanese as this very exotic other culture who do Japanese prints in an interesting way, and the Impressionists really like it, and they all have lovely dressing gowns in Japanese print. That actually saying that it's a cultural exchange, I think, minimizes a lot of the fact that a lot of these non-Western sources come to us through brutality of trades, through like the spice trade and the tea trade and the slave trade, that the brutality of that is the reason why Picasso had lots of African masks in his house. You know, that it's not actually that, you know, we're not
It's not an
pen
equal
pals.
relationship.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I mean, I suppose there's also a relationship between Hollywood and the Bauhaus and Hollywood and manga comics. There are lots of other relationships, which I think would be interesting to unpick, as well as the relationship of empire across the colonial world.
Just though, I think maybe to take it back to Verity's first point, I think this is actually really interesting how the conversation has moved away from understanding what the art or why art should be important to you aesthetically or interestingly, and all the knowledge that you need to understand the art behind it, which I think is what you're originally getting at. And we've suddenly got into this conversation of going into, you know, understanding the influences and all of that. And sometimes I think that's unbelievably intimidating to some people, knowing all the names, knowing the names of the people, knowing the names of the cultures. And it's really important that we convey those things. I mean, I'm an archaeologist by training originally, and understanding where these things come from is inherent in it. But there's a really important aspect of, maybe in a space like this, it's very inviting in some ways, but also there's not all of the infographics that you have in a museum, thankfully increasingly in museums, to explain where these things come from. Equally, if you had all of those infographics, you'd lose the sense of space. So maybe the future of exhibitions is to augment spaces, you know, use the digital world to then put in the clutter that you don't want to see, that would ruin the aesthetic. So, you know, maybe that's a point. But I think that's one thing that that technology can really bring to art, is you can experience the art in, you know, Fionn, you work in a lot of immersive art because you don't want the clutter around you necessarily to take away from the experience. There's something quite brilliant about being in a space where you can just be absorbed by the aesthetic of the thing in front of you. And then it's the interest in the aesthetic that then gets you going, where does that come from? And that brings you, and maybe that's the future of things, because, you know, you're absolutely right to talk about where these kind of certain motifs came from, where styles came from, how they were stolen. I think it's quite, and knowing all the names, that's quite intimidating for the general public.
And to be fair, I will say we have very accessible texts by all of the works here that you can read, and they're sort of in non-jargon language, explaining why the artist has made what they're making and the sort of themes about it. And we are here at the exhibition to actually talk to people when they come in, and if they've got questions, we're there to answer the questions, and we've been having amazing discussions with visitors. I think you're right, we don't want the clutter, but at the same time, people need to be able to access a certain amount of basic information.
Yeah, I think a commonality that I hear is the idea that information or knowledge enhances the experience of experiencing art. But then I would ask the question, does it have to? Or because it's already the notion that we have to have pre-existing knowledge or in order to appreciate something, that is valid in certain contexts, especially, for instance, with the example of Picasso. I think it's important to be aware of where that came from, especially when it's in the context of exploitation and power dynamics. So that's absolutely true. But in a sense, is it not already framing it to consider that there has to be information? Because does it not get in the way of experiencing, feeling the art?
No, I completely get that. And when I make work, it's always with that thing that people will come in, and even if they know nothing about anything, they will go, oh, but what is that? And what is the story of it? And I'm gripped by it. So that aesthetic pleasure has to be there. But I do think it's incredibly off-putting for people if they come into a space and there's like a label with untitled and like, okay, yeah, I'm looking at, and so what you'll find if you look at the kind of little stories effectively that we've written, it's not dry information, it's the story of this is what I've made, this is why I've made it, this might be how I've made it. It's interesting for people because they'll go, oh, is that how that's made? I would not have known. And then they might think, oh, well, I can make that too. So this is about having enabling texts, not texts that are just giving historic context.
And it's something that that I've been like looking into in the work that I do. So I bring comedians into cultural and heritage spaces. So we were in the National Gallery a couple of weeks ago when we go into different fun places and sort of let these improvisers loose or stand-ups or whatever it might be. And the really fun thing about it is letting people know that you're completely allowed to look at a thing that's heralded as like one of the most significant pieces of work in the 20th century and think that it's rubbish. That there's this sense of like, we've got to think that all art is really important and really good and very lofty, because even if you don't like what you're looking at, it's good for your soul and it's good for your brain. And actually loads of art is rubbish. And that's such a freeing thing I found with people coming into the shows where they don't know anything about art, but they quite want to see the comedians or whatever it is, that it's been a nice access point for them because the comedians don't know anything about the art either. But they might be like, actually, that really does stand out to me because I love the fact that he's put a massive shark in a box, and that's enough. That you don't have to then be like, well, the title is all about our sense of mortality. Like, you don't even need to go into that. It's completely fine to be like, I love that because it's massive, or I think that. Like, I think Lowry's really bad at drawing people, so I'm not into it. Like, you're allowed to think that those things are rubbish, and maybe I don't know. Maybe a part of the future of exhibiting is going to be, like letting people be like, oh, I'd take that down. I wouldn't have it in my house. Like, no way.
Following on from that, I think there's a very weak relationship between the commercial side of art, of the art that demands incredibly high prices by the square inch. It's measured by the square inch in value terms, and actually how good the art is. It's how good is your agent at selling it and selling it to the right people, and the more people that buy it, the price goes up. And a lot of that art ends up in a bank vault. It's never seen anyway. It's a commodity just like gold or platinum. And I think that's a huge problem in the art world, because that money is not filtering down to more creative people. It's staying with a small number of privileged people who've got the right agents.
I'd like to say something in favor of the privilege. I think that I was talking to Verity and Fionn and some beforehand. I think there are 4 aspects to how the art market actually works. One is the art market. One is the arts museums. The third one is academia and how writers and critics talk about the work. And then you have the audiences. And these are 4 things which I think actually all need to work together. So if you are an artist and you're putting forward your work today, you need to engage with all of those. And I think in the future of exhibiting, it may be that there will be a different kind of emphasis where audience would be more important in a way, or more emphasized. But I think those 4 will still happen because they do exist today. If we took any of those away, we would not have an art market. And you have to look at the history of patronage of arts, which came from the church or from royalty or whatever, in times gone by. So we have to somehow think about how the whole thing works. And it is that more complicated relationship, which I think I'd love to talk about.
Well, I sort of had a thought as we're talking about, the relationship between the public and the art, and the example that you gave with giving permission for people to feel however they feel about something, and then I made the connection with my art, or what I create, which I post on social media. And on social media, you have the comment section where people, that's their way to engage with what they've seen, whether we agree with it or not. And I don't that well. I do think that comment section tend to be a cesspool of horrible things. But this could be very interesting if there were the equivalent of comment sections to art. If there was somewhere where people could feel free to write, well, I think it's rubbish, without damaging the piece. Where a space where they could also say what they feel about it.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, Joyce, because we've actually got a roll of lining paper here, which we've been asking people to put anything they want up there. And people are sometimes intimidated, but people have put up some kind of odd comments, not horrible, but and done their own drawings and added those in, which we encourage. We've also got a questionnaire. A 1.5 minute questionnaire where people can respond, and comment section. And we are looking at that comment section every day and thinking, could we do this better? So, yeah.
And have you thought about putting one of those sheets of paper next to each one of those pieces?
We haven't got enough room on the walls, Joyce. I mean, come on.
Okay.
I think it was interesting with talking. I guess it comes back into like the issue of commentary and I guess the issue of academia, is that with the lack of resources in any creative field, that there, people who have been pinpointed in art history as being the making or breaking of certain groups or individual artists or movements are art critics, are people, lots of movements who took their whole name from what someone slandered them as in a newspaper, is the fact that there aren't really proper art critics anymore, because there's no funding for art criticism. So most of the time, if you're getting an art critic to write something, unless it's like on their social media where it's a completely sort of neutral but personalized space, you're being paid by the person to write it, so it's PR. I work as an arts writer, and so worked with artists before where they said, I'd really like you to write something about my exhibition, but it would be really great if you could pitch it to newspapers. And I said, well, they're probably not going to accept it because they're going to think it's PR. And they'll say, well, why would it be PR? And it's like, well, because you're paying me to write something, so obviously I'm going to say something nice. If you're that, because there aren't newspapers who want to have a weekly column from an art critic anymore, that you don't get individual journalism that has real impact on your lasting legacy as an artist, because anyone can pay for someone to write something about the work they've done. So we lack that outside voice. So maybe the only way we will get that outside voice is by having more sort of internet critics, or people coming in and feeling like, what they write in the book, they're not going to be like chased down the street and be like, you said something mean in my book. That having some sort of neutral space where people can genuinely sort of let rip, I think it might be the only way. Yes, the only way forward.
And I should mention that we haven't actually paid Verity an awful lot of money to say and she's just doing our newsletter and an afterwards, so we're clear.
And I've been horrible about it.
Oh, well, I'm not paying that final installment. Okay.
I was just going to say, more in your description, actually, it's interesting. It's got quite an element of ritual to it. Actually, the interplay between those four entities have this kind of ritual. But then some of what we're talking about is the disruption of that ritual and how that ritual is disappearing. I wonder how much you kind of wish we could go back to the tradition of the previous ritual, but equally how maybe there's not the funding for that. What I see sometimes with the kind of concept of having a critic is this idea that they're going to do some kind of curation of the work as it comes through, and then be able to pick out for the public that this is worth going to see, that's probably not worth going to see. But then that creates in this ritual what Verity was describing of, oh, well, that person said it was good, so I have to say it's good. I can't say it's rubbish. So we have this very strange interplay, which I think the digital world has really disrupted. for better or worse. I think probably for better, because increasingly that kind of peer review that's very exclusive has been often shown to not be entirely trustworthy. And I think that's maybe what Alan was getting at with, galleries really absolutely monetizing things just because they identified the commercial aspect. Yeah, so it is interesting. I mean, what do you think of the next ritual, I suppose?
But can I just
Well-
interject and say it's not that different from the ritual of food critics and food reviews and restaurants that get very good reviews. But I don't think people feel the same sense of the need to be reverent. So you could go to a restaurant that had a very good review and say, yeah, but I had a rubbish experience there and the food I ate was not very good. And you're kind of allowed that more than in the sort of art world. Sorry, Maureen. True.
I so sorry, just to be different from what's the conversation. I wouldn't want to rubbish anybody's work. I think if somebody has actually put pen to paper or made some sort of framed something or even framed a dance, I would like to be able to respect that person and the human entity that they are, because they've done something which is important to them. Whether I personally can relate to it or not is an open question. If I have a conversation with them, if I read about their work, if they tell me why they made that, then I am more likely to understand and join in that conversation by interacting with that piece of work. Now, we've heard the word rubbish from everybody here, and not from you, okay? Okay. And rubbish itself is an interesting concept, because we've had lots of conversations with audiences that have come in to look at our work in terms of error theory. Remember, we had that yesterday, a few days ago, I think last week, error theory. We had a conversation about randomness. We had a conversation about recycling rubbish. So I think the word rubbish in itself has got interesting connotations. Because we want to be able to embrace rubbish and understand why we might have an adverse reaction to something. And I think that adverse reaction is interesting to analyze.
And also, as artists, I think we should be very wary of calling other people's work rubbish, because apart from anything else, people could call our work rubbish. But it's not just that. It's if you choose the life of an artist, it's not the easiest of lives. To be fair, I'd rather be an artist than a doctor or a dentist, but although it'd be useful. But often it's luck. And we've had this conversation about Marina Abramovich, whose work I love. And I think, well, she had luck and just a lucky break here and there. And if she hadn't had that luck, she would still be doing what she's doing, because that's that's her passion. That's her way of understanding the world. And I think, for a lot of artists, whether we like their work or not, it is their way of understanding the world. And it might be very different from our ways of understanding the world.
Yeah, and Maureen, I think you're completely correct. I mean, I think we've been using the word rubbish quite flippantly, but I mean, it's a matter of taste, I suppose. It's just rubbish is quite maybe a harsh term. It can be used as one, but it's oh, I like that, or oh, that's not really for me. And I think one of the things that's maybe quite intimidating about art, which I think you were touching on, was and Joyce, you were talking about too, is feeling that you can have an opinion or you can do something, you can put a pen to paper or a paintbrush to paper, and that it doesn't matter what other people think. And that it's for you and for anyone who enjoys it. Or maybe, some people do things that they want other people to hate, and I know that that's also a form of art. People want to evoke that feeling of grotesque or disgust. I mean, that is also a form of art, and I think that is something that's quite that it's not necessarily meant to be exclusive, but you have people in society who don't feel like they can be that brave. And maybe that's the thing about art, and actually being able to walk around a gallery is going, no, you can be brave and you can go and do this. And equally, you know, maybe if an artist hears that someone says they didn't like their work, well, then hopefully they'll take from it that other people did. The only problem with that is people are more inclined to give negative reviews than positive. But anyway, that's the psychology of it. But yeah.
Yeah, I think we've got a bit hung up on the word rubbish, which was my fault, which was my fault, and I do apologise for it. But I think it's not the sense that like we can all get together as a jury and be like, well, that's rubbish, and we've all agreed, and thus it is decreed that it is rubbish. It's like people having the freedom to go around and be like, there's actually a weight lifted off your shoulders to not like things. Yeah. I think, and it's different to food criticism. I think it was a really great point that there is not a cultural pressure that all food is important and beautiful and will raise you higher in this journey we call life. But with art, there is this sense that if you get art, if you're clever and you get art and you're cultured and you're lofty, all art has a real depth and beauty to it that you'll be able to unlock because you're one of the inheritors of this, you know, of this mindset. And actually being able to let that go and say, I'm going to go to an exhibition, and if I don't like it, that doesn't make me wrong. And go like, oh, it wasn't for me, and that's completely acceptable, rather than it wasn't for me, so I must not get it. You can be like, I get it, and I didn't like it.
And yeah, just wanted to add that this was, maybe that was implicit, implied, and which I should have made it clearer, but that was in the context of, in the situation where the artist would be looking for ways to connect with the audience, but also absolutely, first of all, that shouldn't be a requirement. There are artists who may not feel, as you described, this could be a visceral need to express oneself, and that doesn't mean that you are ready or have any intentions to be exposed to what people might feel about it. That's absolutely right. And also, even for those who choose to, you know, open their art to comments, they also have the right to not be exposed to it and to not be exposed to people's opinion. So that also is absolutely that should be affirmed.
And can I also say, the artist has every right to say, I don't care if you don't like it.
Yeah,
I've made it. It's for me. So
I was just thinking on this. I wonder how much. Well, one of the problems with being human, I think, which is a weird thing to say, but is people are very drawn towards rating things, and it's very, very quick that people will start looking at comments and go, "Ooh, can I see how many positive and how many negative," and make a quick decision on that. And there's lots of reasons we're wired to make quick decisions, and there's lots of like terrible repercussions of that, I think. And I do wonder how much the future of technology in art will feed that monster necessarily. But maybe the future should be a little bit more, you know, if we had more resource in society, then I think that's the thing. People make snap decisions. We're wired to make snap decisions, to be easy and resource efficient. The more resource you have in society, the more you have capacity to think and time and opportunity to think and absorb things. So yeah, I mean, there's going to be an interesting interplay, I think, in the future between that technology of rating and people's time.
I mean, I was thinking, I mean, I just can't, speaking to Verity, I can't get rid of my love and hate relationship with art history. It's in me. I can't not relate from a more intellectual and knowledgeable perspective about the kind of things we're talking about. And so please excuse me if I am, but I'm not doing it to alienate, but to just open up. And I remember very clearly in the ICA, there was an artist called Mary Kelly. I don't know if you remember. And she put, and I think it was in the end of the 70s, if I'm right, and she put on the wall, framed, babies' nappies and menstrual blood and stuff like that. And that was really important at the time for the feminist movement to put this kind of thing, to talk about sort of more psychodynamic relationships that mothers and have with their babies, with bodily fluids, with all of this kind of stuff. Now, somebody could come and say this is all rubbish because it doesn't look like a portrait of something, without the explanation of why it's important to frame things which are maybe rejected or abjected or not the kind of thing that we would think of putting there. And I'm thinking about, for example, Cézanne and Van Gogh and people that were not accepted in their lifetime, that the critics did not like their work, did not understand what they were doing. And they were considered as sort of outsider art, if you like, that couldn't, like Cézanne, he couldn't draw perspective, but he had thrown out the rule book and he was doing something different. And Van Gogh as well. So, and those are, today, they are, I wouldn't say revered, I wouldn't use that word, but they're seen as radicals in terms of the time that they lived in. So I think artists, part of what we do, and anybody who's creating any processes, we need to be radical. We need to reframe our experiences and do things that have not been done before, no matter whether they're rated, good or bad in other people's eyes. It is about whether we think it's important, and when we're talking to other artists, why we think it's important. And I think conversations between artist and audience, that triangle, is really important. To say, why are you framing, your baby's nappy? Or why are you framing this, that, whatever it is? Why are you choosing to call that an art object? It's only a cupboard or whatever. Because it is the conversation where we can have differences of opinion, and like we're having today, because I think it's really interesting easing out our differences, because that points to what our different experiences that we bring to the table.
It's also interesting to see how the conversation has very much centered around the present of exhibiting and the past of exhibiting. And it's hard to envisage the future of exhibiting. And it's a bit like looking at, looking in a crystal ball, political situations as they arise. This time last year, could we have imagined the world would be in the place it is now, or 2 years ago, or 10 years ago? And so what do we imagine for art? And I guess the one thing that we can as artists imagine is maybe where our own practices might be generally heading. And that's about as much as we can see into the future.
Just to share with you one thing about Frank Bowling, the artist Frank Bowling, big colour field paintings. He's got his work with the help of Hauser and Worth, who is his gallery and agent at the moment, on big posters along in the road, sharing with the people walking by his kind of work. And I think that is really bringing the arts right into the high street. And with all these retail shops that have all closed down, high street after high street is devastated with just closed shops. We can open those shops up, bring people in to do creative processes, bring people in to work with artists so they can actually be part of the conversation.
And who funds this? Because we've thank
the
you,
local
Rishi
councils.
Sunak. We would like a large, HS2 is not getting finished. We could take that money and we could change the face of our cities in terms of art.
But at the moment, those local shops are not opened. And local councils can, like they do for charity shops, they can arrange for artists to come in. And there are some examples of high streets doing that with artist collectives right now.
There is another side to this. That, as I was saying, that Arden's work could be in a park or could be in a shopping centre. We're not just democratising it. We're also enforcing that art. We're pushing that art on people, whether they want it or not. and we did see this with Pokemon. That Pokemon was causing traffic accidents and was in private property, and people were breaking over people's garden fences and things. So I think we have to be careful. An interesting example is the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, which I think is great. I think it's great that it causes reaction. I'd almost say art is anything which causes a reaction, whether that's positive or negative. And it got people talking about art and talking about the environment, and maybe also looking at the 3 other statues, which were of rather unpleasant people.
I love that point about like you're going to look at this art whether you like it or not, and I think that sort of that it like nicely encompasses the issue, which is like I think it's brilliant to have art on billboards and like Yinky Laurie's M&S bags and these kinds of things, and I think the crux of that issue the decision to do that is to have lots of different types of art by lots of different types of artists available. So it's not just like if all the billboards were the same 5 dead Caucasian males from art history, then what else is anyone else going to glean from that? But actually, if you've got billboards with all different sorts of things and different types of technologies and different types of artists represented, then there is a sort of you're going to consume this whether you like it or not, but at least there's some level of choice.
Can I just say, I've had experience of exhibiting in the weirdest places because I ran a project called Irish Wave in China for 6 years. And we used to get sort of spaces, empty retail spaces in China Central Mall and have to hang work. I can tell you, it's very difficult to curate an exhibition like that. I was given a beautician space at one point, which had all, just had mirrors everywhere and mosaic. And it was a struggle to find any way of hanging anything or putting anything in the space, but it was a laugh. I mean, and what I will say is that, because we've only spoken about the experience in the West, really, of art, China is another case in point, and the art world in China has certain points of intersection with the art world here, but it's a very different kettle of fish. And one of the things that has always struck me about the Chinese public is their sense of ownership over their own visual perceptions. And everywhere people will go, oh yeah, that's interesting, I like that. What's the story behind? Oh yeah, okay. And people have no hesitation in going up. In fact, they don't have enough hesitation because there's a lot of touching goes on and you're like, yes, please don't touch. Oh, you mean like this? Yeah. So that goes on a lot, but there is an immense enthusiasm for visual culture with no holds barred. People don't think that they're not entitled to look or comment or have a view on things. And that it's interesting to see. I think in a sense, Britain is one of the places where there's the most hesitancy about visual culture. I think other countries in Europe, it's less hesitant, actually.
I find it interesting because you talk about a sense of ownership of what they think about it, but I would also say maybe a sense of ownership of the space, and I think that perhaps one of the reasons why people might have reactions to art, besides what it inspires them, but it's also because there's an awareness that in order for this piece to be exhibited in this specific place, in a place that might be public, it has to have gone through several filters and vetting, and sometimes that could be what people are sort of challenging. Why did this of all of the other things? Why is this presented to me as worthy of recognition, of worthy of appreciation? So there's also this aspect that the public might not be reacting to the artist, for instance, but more the whole structure behind it, whether true or imagined and assumed. So that's another issue. But there's also a power dynamic here between, even if it's not a person, but a piece being exhibited, that already says something, and that imposes something on the individual or the public or the community that exists in that space.
So has anybody got any more comments about the future of exhibiting? Where are we actually heading? And is it going to be disastrous? Is it going? I mean, I think there's obviously going to be the effect of social media, which is a pretty new phenomenon in terms of exhibiting. And Joyce, have you noticed the impact on, say, for example, the perception of art through social media?
Well, I don't know if I'm in any particular position to answer the question. Well, I've noticed the impact of social media on people's interaction and socializing, so it must also affect the arts, but I'm not necessarily very optimistic or positive about the way that it's affected the way that we engage with each other as people. So now what does it do to art? I'm not sure, maybe.
Yeah, I think yeah, because I guess that's the bit of social media that I like exist on specifically. Would be that social media is now like where not only for visual arts but for performing arts, like it used to be the case that if you wanted to be an actor or you wanted to be a comedian, you had to take a show up to Edinburgh because that's where the agents were going to be, and they were going to be scouting in real life. And same thing with artists, you know, like I need to get my portfolio out there, I need to make sure that I'm, you know, getting physically out there as much as I can. And now there's been such a retreat into social media, and that being where people find each other, and a lot of the times young gallerists, young curators finding other young artists via social media, and that's like their main form of communication with each other. So I'm pretty sure that will continue. But I have been, every time I've been asked to predict what things are going to last, I've been so wrong. Like 4 years ago, I was like, Clubhouse, this is going to be the next big thing forever. Within 6 months, it was like users down to 0. And then for NFTs, I was like, this isn't going to stick around for long. And then a month later was the massive Christie's sale. So I've not been great at predicting these things. But
You were worried about NFTs. It's dead now.
I was just delayed. I was on a different time. I was like, publish it a year later, and then we're all good. Yeah, I'm sure that the digital space is going to continue to have like a really strong hold on who finds who. So I think for artists, it's almost like having your work be beautiful in real life almost is no longer enough. Now, I know artists who make beautiful things, but they photograph terribly, so they're never found online. Or, you know, they make a beautiful painting and then they frame it with a glass that has a glare to it, so no one photographs it at the exhibition. I mean, galleries are now really aware of the fact that which pieces get photographed and shared online most are the ones without glass in them, because people don't have to then have their own face in the picture as well. That I think that these things are I think that's going to be more and more the case, that people have to adapt their practice to online rather than adapting their online persona to their practice, maybe.
So has anybody got a final comment to make? Maureen? Great.
I think it's quite interesting in terms of the tools that we use as artists, because I know, Fionn, you started using tilt brush a few years ago and have developed a whole practice, and then you're now working with Arden with AR, and I think lots of these tools are now becoming more available. I'm not saying they're completely cheap, but they are more available for the professional artist rather than just a commercial game studio or a commercial platform. Alan, you're using electronics, as we were talking about before. I'm using electronics, and in our piece, we're using Arduino and Unity and 3D printing and all sorts of things which are available to emerging artists and established artists, not necessarily in a commercial way. So as things move on, these technologies become more accessible. And I think that's an important point, because with those technologies being more accessible, they can actually go out on platforms that can be seen online through gaming platforms, through social media and so on. So there is a movement forward in order to, it's like the advent of the printing press. And we're in that whole wave now of people having electronic tools.
But I would almost argue that we're in the counter wave, because now people are involved in bringing materiality back to the digital and virtual world. And I think, you know, this is something that interests me a lot, that it's not either or, that it can be a blended experience. And maybe that is something we can say about the future of exhibiting, that we're heading towards a blended experience. Yes. And unless somebody would like to add in another note. Yeah.
I've just got a thought about art education. Yes. So art education in the past 15 years or something has been very derivative of the masters, if you like, which I think actually takes people away from the joy of using work of telling their own stories, and children are being asked to, can you paint like a Picasso? Can you paint like a Monet? Can you paint like this other person somewhere in history? Which is irrelevant to now. And I think the whole of art, the national curriculum for art, ought to change to allow to grow people and let them be storytellers in whichever medium they want about the stories that are important for them and their families and the communities, which is a different emphasis. I'm not throwing art history out of the window, because as you know, I carry that burden with me, but I'm just saying it is only one. It's only there to use, as well as being able to focus on storytelling and the creative process.
But to be fair, Maureen, that varies enormously from school to school. There are schools where kids are absolutely enabled to do that, and others where they are not. So there's no sort of level playing field in terms of art education. And I think what is very clear is with the emphasis of our current government, hopefully not for too long more, there is that view that, and I'm being political, there is that view that art is not important and that basically it's the 3 R's. And it's a reductive view of education, which has had, I think, psychologically a really negative impact on so many students in this country.
Well, I think it's also because actually life is multidisciplinary. So thinking about the 3 R's, numbers are an art, writing is an art, reading is storytelling, and art is visual language, and music is musical language. All of these things need to be taken together, and also technology and science. We have been working towards STEAM, which is STEM with the art in parts, so that's science, technology, engineering, art, and maths or manufacturing, depending on who you're talking to. And actually the world needs an integration of all these skills based on that person's experience. And the syllabus should be there, national curriculum should be there to help people, support them. And I think it is used like a thing you have to, and I'm sorry to disagree with you, but the national curriculum does actually say, when you read it, you have to teach children to paint like these masters, to understand that. And I think it's only one aspect.
But actually knowing a number of heads of arts, they don't necessarily follow that at all.
Yes. So the de facto practice is different from the regulation.
We do have one comment. I think
we have a comment. Glyn, could you have a look at that comment and see what somebody is saying? We've actually got somebody watching us. This is unbelievable.
on the right-hand side, I think.
Right, okay.
No? Okay.
Arjun, do you want to have...
Oh, okay.
Oh, I see.
Sorry,
right, well, on that... on that... Art galleries are not open in the evenings because people have to go home. They have families, they have lives.
Yes, the Tate has got Fridays opening times, and I think there's a certain area in, well, I don't know recently, but Hoxton used to have Thursday late night openings. So there are some places which have late night openings for art galleries. I don't know.
Well, they're massively well attended, so these late night events, but they basically, a lot of galleries have realised all the people who come in are retired or on maternity leave with their young children, that they've realised that there's like a big gap in the market, which is where I slip in and say we should do a comedy night in one of them. But like the National Gallery do a Friday late, and they're filled to the brim. And I think for a lot of galleries, that's the only way they can get people who are in a working age bracket in, because it's like, well, I've clocked off at 6. And now I can't go and nip to wherever in the daytime.
Can I just add to that? I think the National Gallery, or the National Portrait Gallery, I don't know if it still does it, but it was doing a drawing workshop on a Friday evening. So that's exactly, so I think this is great.
It is, but I think we're not going to bore our viewers by going on talking amongst ourselves anymore. I think we've covered quite a lot of points that maybe they will share. I hope so. And people are actually commenting, Glyn, or this will all have to be edited out. Hey, that's really cool. Thank you very much. Way, that's really good. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you to Maureen Kendall, to Ardern Beam Human, to Hume Beeman. I've done it again. Sorry, Ardern. Sorry. Ardern, Hume Beeman, and I've had no drink taken, and Joris Lechen, Alan Hudson, and Verity Babs, and Glyn Jones, who is filming for us, and myself, Fionn Gunn. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Thank you.